Jennifer Layke, for her to begin introducing the report, and then I will be back to talk to you about some of these 8 actions in a few minutes.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and hello to all. We're delighted that you were able to join us today. This report, this guidebook, designed to deliver strategies and approaches to urban leaders, is the culmination of over 5 years of work stemming back through a partnership with Johnson Controls and over a dozen other organizations who worked with us in initiating and creating an 8-action menu for urban leaders. These are the types of activities that can be implemented through policies, through programs, or through project-level activities, learning by doing strategies. We'll talk a little bit about them as we go through the webinar and explore these topics in more depth. For those of you who are not familiar, the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities focuses in on providing support for cities in major economies, and we work with over 55 cities at the WRI Ross Center, and we have 8 practice areas. One is building energy efficiency, and we're delighted to tell you more about our work with these cities in subsequent communications and emails. Our building efficiency work specifically focuses on 4 interventions: building private-public collaboration to support building efficiency projects and policies, scaling business and finance models, improving information on building energy performance, and making the information transparent to stakeholders in the building sector and in cities, and to help support the evolution towards high performance and net zero energy buildings and the integration of buildings into a clean urban energy system. The premise of our work is that, in fact, the interconnection between buildings and cities will be a determinant of the quality of life for people who live in urban cities, in urban areas around the world. This report outlines both the what the business case is, the why to get involved with building efficiency, as well as the how. On the why, we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute, we see the sustainable development benefits of cities focusing on energy efficiency in a myriad of social, environmental, and economic ways. The report that we're talking through today can be found both in a PDF version as well as an interactive online version. The website is at the bottom of the screen here, and we welcome your feedback and input. We welcome more case studies and engagement around the content, and we're delighted that to make this the first online report that WRI has published. So let's take a look at some of the content in the report. We focus at the initial area of the report on why efficient buildings. And as many of you know and we're very familiar with, there is a critical function that buildings play in cities. They provide shelter, they provide services, healthcare, education, and city services, as well as housing. So if we focus on buildings as a solution, we can make our energy use more efficient, we can reduce the long-term demand for energy and thereby reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally, and we can focus on providing better strategies to connect our buildings to increase energy access, making every kilowatt hour stretch further, and creating local markets for decades and providing good jobs in the energy industry. Why focus now on building efficiency? As you can see in this chart, all the projections are that the building emission profile is rising significantly. As communities become wealthier, they're going to be asking for more services, larger living areas, better appliance access, and more energy. And so our goal is to decouple the provision of those services and buildings with the need for energy and the resulting emissions. We know that the use of energy by buildings is one of the contributors to illness and death in many cities and in countries around the world because of the emissions associated with particulate levels, as well as the impacts of soot and other types of environmental pollution. At IPCC, IEA, and many other organizations have analyzed the role of building efficiency in reducing emissions, and in fact it is the low-hanging fruit, as many call it, and the one strategy that can be used most cost effectively to reduce emissions. But why cities? We focus on cities because, in fact, they are the centers of the productivity and consumption, using over 70% of energy, and today housing 54% of global population, as well as producing 80% of global gross domestic product globally. And the trend will continue. We now have 54% of the world or over 50% of the world living in cities, and it will be 70% by 2050. So there are three things that we care about as cities begin to grow in this expansion that we're undertaking, which is unprecedented. First, we have to think about the urban form, where we put our buildings, how we zone and plan for our cities matters. How we think about the performance of those buildings and the ability for us to make those buildings as efficient as possible, and how we connect the buildings in our cities to district-level energy solutions and to city-scale opportunities for improved urban efficiency. These are all critical parts of a planning or a process that a city could undertake, but often, because energy has in many places been the purview of the national government's planning strategies, cities have not had to think through an energy strategy that connects the building scale to the district scale and to the city scale. So this report builds that bridge and focuses on where and how cities and the energy efficiency agenda for buildings come together. We know that today's choices in the built environment are locking us in to emissions and energy demand. They lock in the residents to a certain level of utility bills, and they have long-lasting implications. Buildings are part of the infrastructure that lasts for, as we saw earlier, 40 years. And in fact, be thinking about buildings as part of an energy strategy is critical at the outset because of the long-term nature of those investments. But we know that although the technologies and solutions are available in many markets, there are barriers that remain that prohibit these solutions from moving easily and scaling in specific markets. When we asked at Johnson Controls, asked the market participants what were their biggest barriers, they were around awareness, around the ability to understand the technical choices, around the inability to judge the performance of the various options, market barriers around whether people were going to be in those buildings or had ownership of the buildings in order to make those investments, and finally to thinking about where and how they could implement those activities if they wanted to make those investments and what the policies meant. So we looked at a set of actions that could be critical in overcoming those market barriers. And we looked at it from not just one perspective, but from a variety of perspectives. Stakeholders who influence the market, whether that be a bank, where you would need to go to think about a finance option, or whether it is a construction company thinking about how you would design your new building. The actions that we outline in the report provide a set of ideas specifically designed to various leaders around improving buildings and building stock. They may apply at different levels, whether that's in the new building space or with existing buildings, and finally with some of the methods for revitalizing and rebuilding. They also apply for different leaders. City governments have specific opportunities and different levels of control around those types of strategies, the 8 actions that we outline. The actions include a variety of pieces here that are on this chart. I'm going to hand it over to Eric, and Eric will describe the 8 actions and move into some more depth.
Sure, thanks, Jennifer. So there are 8 actions that we outline in the report. I'm not going to go into great depth on each of them because some of our subsequent speakers will be touching on them with more compelling examples from their practice. But I will feature a few of these. So what we have here are the 8 actions that are described in the report, and they range from kind of policy and program mechanisms to strategies around engaging specific key groups of stakeholders. I'm going to touch briefly on codes and standards, targets for energy efficiency, and then government leadership by example, just as an introductory sense of what's in the content in this report, and there's a lot more on these other topics. So action 1, building efficiency codes and standards. So these are really, in a lot of ways, the foundation of energy efficiency practices in buildings, setting the floor for the performance of buildings. And they're regulatory tools that require this minimum level of energy efficiency in buildings. It's important that they're customized and they're localized to the context in a particular nation or even city. And this is also, this is often thought about as a role that's of key importance to national governments, but in the realm of actually implementing building codes, making sure they're being used in standard practice and in construction, this is a key role for local governments as well. So it's very important to be thinking about how that relationship, not only with the broader set of stakeholders in the building community, but between national, provincial and state governments and then local governments, how they're collaborating to implement building codes and standards. So one example on that from Europe, which I think is a pretty advanced example, but I think a compelling one in many ways, is the European-wide policy for an energy performance of buildings directive, which has been being in the process of implemented for over a decade at this point and has been improved over time. Different nations and different cities are expected to implement these, but using their own choices that they make that's relevant to their local market. Brussels, Belgium is a particularly interesting example because they approach this process as really a kind of a consensus process, a stakeholder-driven process, where they introduced early on, before they even introduced the stricter building code standards, recognition for developers and building owners who went above and beyond, and public recognition, and in some cases even funding recognition for the activities they were doing. So what they had done is they used a kind of leadership by example process among businesses to move the standard practice to a higher level before it was even implemented as a required policy. And so when it came time to actually implement it as a code, the building community was very supportive of it because they had already begun transforming their practices. So in that way, this is actually a really good example of both codes and standards and what we have to talk about for Action 6, engagement of owners and occupants of buildings. Action 2, energy efficiency improvement targets. This is something that research has found is actually one of the most valuable actions that can be taken, about setting a clear commitment with quantitative goals for reductions in building energy use. Just by understanding, making a commitment to improvement, and making it measurable, and having a political commitment behind that, organizations and governments are able to much more effectively manage and improve their energy use. So there's several variations on this. Some cities have begun setting these targets at a city-wide scale in various forms, thinking about either energy improvements or often emissions-related improvements that are implemented in buildings. Governments can set them themselves for their own operations, and often there are also voluntary targets that governments or other actors encourage businesses and building owners to take on around improving their energy use and better managing their energy use over time. I'll give an example of that in a second, along with this action number 5, government leadership by example. So Governments can set targets, as we just discussed, but thinking about how do they achieve those targets, what are some of the options available to governments. Two of the most common things that we find are public building retrofit and energy management programs, actively managing, understanding the energy use in buildings, and then having a commitment and a process to improve that energy use over time through either operational changes or technology changes through retrofits and otherwise. As well as another important strategy in this category is procurement regulation. So thinking about how governments purchase the products they need to provide services and procure the services that they're providing to their citizens, and making sure that energy efficiency is a consideration in how that process is done. So one example from Buenos Aires in Argentina combines the two of these. Buenos Aires had set a target for greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 30% below 2008 levels by 2030. And this, one of the major strategies they had for this was around implementing a program for improving public buildings. So they started by analyzing their energy use consumption patterns for a set of buildings, and then using that information to identify priorities for action, specific interventions they can make in operations, as well as capital investments in those buildings, and then expanded that process over time to include other buildings and a more comprehensive kind of energy management process that became focused more on continuous improvement. So at this point, they have about 20 buildings have undergone audits and are implementing improvements. And there, for new buildings as well, new public buildings, there are now certain minimum criteria that relate to environmental sustainability as well as energy that are being implemented. So a good example of how targets can then be implemented through a government leadership program. So that's just a couple of examples. I want to turn it over to our other speakers to dig into more from examples from their experience. But this report is really a guidebook for urban leaders to help them think about a pathway to accelerating building efficiency, and not just what to do, but how to do it. The focus really is on collaborative action, understanding what's needed from stakeholders, which stakeholders need to be involved, and a process for how to engage them to really identify a customizable path. What's important for a particular place, what actions make the most sense when to build, to have some successes, and then build over time toward greater improvement in energy efficiency in buildings through working together. So that's again our kind of summary image. Take a look at the guidebook. I hope this will be a valuable tool for you as a reference point in your work, whatever sort of urban leader you are, or however you want to influence urban leaders. This does have content for you about how action on building efficiency can be taken, and how to influence action by others. So take a look at the WRI.org/building efficiency to get access to the report. And so with that, I'm going to hand this over to the team in Denver. Elizabeth and Katrina, we're going to hand you presenter rights, and you can tell us about your work in Denver.
Wonderful. Thanks, Eric. Okay, so in Denver, we have taken an approach that uses a lot of the different 8 kind of tools that the report talks about. And we want to walk you through the story of how we've gotten to where we are today, kind of the progression from the early stages of focusing a lot on municipal action around energy efficiency, and then moving forward to where we are today, which is really engaging with the private sector and looking at building efficiency policy that would cover our whole community. So when we look at where the source of our greenhouse gas emissions come from in Denver, we see that about 57% of our emissions are from our commercial and multifamily buildings. It's the single largest proportion of our emissions, right ahead of transportation. And so we knew from the beginning when we were doing our climate action planning that this would be a really important area for us to focus in on and to devise some effective strategies to bring down emissions from that sector. So several years ago, the city really made some pretty strong commitments to improve the efficiency of its own buildings. We, through our Executive Order 123, require all of our buildings to certify their ENERGY STAR score annually if they can qualify for that certification. Just this past year, we had 8 buildings that qualified for ENERGY STAR, and we certified those buildings. We also have to incorporate LEED, existing buildings, operations, and maintenance into all of our operations work across the city. And we've set a city goal through the executive order to achieve 20% energy savings by 2020 across our full city building portfolio. And we're well on our way to do that. What we know about energy efficiency, and the city has seen this through its own work to date, is that there is a huge economic opportunity in those energy efficiency investments. So these numbers that show a potential in Denver alone of $1.3 billion in energy savings if we invest $340 million in our private buildings across the city over 7 years, we will see that huge return on investment of $1.3 billion in energy savings. And those numbers come from the Rockefeller Foundation Group study in 2012, and we scaled those numbers down to the square footage of the city and county of Denver, just to look at the size of the opportunity just within our own city. And so we know that these kinds of savings can come from, what would be considered the low-hanging fruit or off-the-shelf technologies that exist today. And so when we saw that really borne out in our own efforts through our own city buildings, we really wanted to take that opportunity and figure out how to unlock it throughout our whole community, looking at our private buildings as well. So another area where the city has been very active to date is trying to get better access and better rules around energy data. And so in the state of Colorado, our Public Utilities Commission is the state body that has authority over regulating our investor-owned utilities. Our utility here in Denver is Xcel Energy, and the commission sets the various rules that protect consumer data privacy and govern how Xcel Energy can share data both with customers as well as with third parties. And so there were some barriers in our existing rules to building owners being able to access whole building aggregated data for the purposes of benchmarking, understanding their energy use across the whole building. And so we, as the city, as well as other stakeholders, intervened in a filing at the commission around data access and privacy to request that the commission consider providing whole building aggregated data access to building owners without individual customer consent, as long as there were 4 or more tenants in a building and no tenant was using more than 50% of the energy in the building. And so that rule was actually adopted by the commission, and that actually allowed building owners to get access a lot easier than they would have otherwise, because under the previous rules, it was a 15-15 rule. So any building that had 15 or fewer tenants, you had to actually get individual customer consent for every single one of those tenants in order to get that aggregated data made available to you. And so this really eases the way for the vast majority of buildings to get the data very easily from their utility. And then we also work with our utility to pilot and beta test a program that provides automatic upload of the whole building aggregated data to the Energy Star Portfolio Manager account. So those 2 steps in tandem really make it a whole lot easier for building owners to take that fundamental first step to benchmark their building and to understand their energy usage. So it was a huge win for us. It was something that really laid the groundwork for our future work kind of moving forward with policy, because it took down one of the kind of main barriers that would exist for a building owner to be able to benchmark their building. And we had a great partnership with our utility. There were other cities that in the service territory of our utility that had already done a benchmarking requirement, and so we were able to also learn some lessons from those other cities, and we were able to work together to get our utility to provide this service. So it was kind of a great partnership and a great outcome. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Katrina Managan, our energy efficiency expert here at the city, to talk more about how we began working with the private sector through some voluntary programs and then our policy development as well.
Great, thank you, Liz. So simultaneously, as we worked to get building owners whole building access to whole building data so that they could measure their energy performance, we created a benchmarking program where we recognize any building that benchmarks. And we created this program because building an owner can't manage what they don't measure. So Energy Star Portfolio Manager is a free tool that property managers can use to get a 1 to 100 energy performance score for their building, and 50 is the national average. So this program started about 2 years ago. We have 86 participating buildings today, and it's growing all the time. We also wrote case studies of some of the leading buildings that we had. We partnered with key community groups in running this program, such as the Building Owners and Managers Association, the International Facility Management Association, our local utility, Xcel Energy, the Energy Efficiency Business Coalition. And the goal of the program was really to recognize and celebrate leaders, and in doing so, to try to get more buildings copying what those leaders are doing. So one of the case studies that we wrote was about the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce. They did a major renovation of their building, and while they were doing that renovation, they invested $280,000 to pay sort of for premium energy efficiency upgrades and lighting and their air handler and their new boiler, and they see $40,000 in annual savings in that building now on their utility bills. So that's a 7-year simple payback, and we estimate that that increased the value of their building by $424,000. So it's a really good investment for them. I know they're really happy with that in their new space. They also took their Energy Star score from a 45, just below the national average, up to 80, and that benchmark was a key part of how they really tracked their success, and now they're an Energy Star certified building. Another program that we created was our Lease for Efficiency Challenge. We launched this a year ago, and the way this program works is that businesses that rent space in Denver, so the tenants in our office buildings, commit to ask one powerful little question next time they rent space in Denver. Just what is that 1 to 100 Energy Star score of the building? And the reason we created this is because as we asked property managers of our office buildings and building owners, how can the city help improve energy efficiency in buildings, they said, help educate our tenants, because often they don't value the investments that we make in energy efficiency, and it makes it harder to make those investments because at the end of the day we're serving the tenant's needs. So we really did this effort educating the tenant businesses across Denver. We have 44 tenants across Denver that rent 2.5 million square feet. We kicked off that program last October. Other things that we're doing to really try to encourage building owners to invest more in energy efficiency is making sure they have the financing available to pay for upgrades. So PACE is the Property Assessed Clean Energy, is a program that the state of Colorado has created, and the city of Denver is in the process of signing up for that statewide program. And how that program works is that a building owner can repay an energy efficiency loan through a special property tax assessment. And there's a couple of advantages to financing an efficiency upgrade that way. That one, the assessments can be passed along to tenants under most leases, and secondly, the property tax assessment stays with the property on sale. So you can have a loan term up to 20 years, and it's structured such that the monthly repayment of the loan is less than the energy savings. So you're coming out cash flow positive as an owner from day one, and then that loan stays with the property when it's sold. So if someone only has a hold period of 5 years for a building, they can still invest in a longer term energy efficiency improvement. There's also lots of other lenders offering energy efficiency loans in Denver. So we spent some time really working with the finance community to assess if the city needed to be, supplementing this in some way, and largely concluded that there's lots of providers that are both qualified by our local utility. There's providers focused on submarkets such as condo loans, and there's other providers that are also just active here and nationally doing energy efficiency loans. So lots of capital is available to pay for good projects in Denver. So what we did as we ran all of those programs, we kept assessing, are we on track to meet our climate goals? Are we unlocking that opportunity that we know is out there with $1.3 billion in energy savings in our existing buildings? And the program, while getting 86 buildings signed up for our benchmarking program is great, there's 1,800 buildings over 50,000 square feet in Denver. And so we're not actually getting unlocking that full opportunity or reaching our climate goals just with these programs alone is what we concluded. So we concluded after trying all of those programs that we really needed to do more to encourage that investment in energy efficiency. So we created the Energize Denver Task Force to work on existing building energy efficiency back in December of 2015. And so based on the task force's work, the city is going to develop and implement new building efficiency programs and policies. So what we did was really lay out a goal for the task force, and that is to improve the energy efficiency of existing commercial and multifamily buildings 10% by 2020 and double that, so 20% by 2030. And if you click on or go to this website, energizedenver.org, you can see who our task force members are. We wanted a really balanced group of stakeholders from across the real estate community. So we have property managers, building owners, investors from both commercial buildings and apartments. We have low-income housing providers, energy efficiency businesses, green building experts. Xcel Energy, our local utility, sits on the task force. So we have a balanced group of 20 stakeholders who really set their own goal that they want to also be thinking about the broader set of stakeholders who aren't at the table. And so they've come up with a really thoughtful set of recommendations. But before I get to what they're currently recommending, right now they've met 7 out of 8 times. So the recommendations aren't yet final, but they're in process. And some of why, before I get to what they're recommending, I want to talk a little bit about why they're really thinking that a more ambitious policy and this more ambitious goal makes sense. So who really benefits if we unlock this efficiency opportunity in Denver? Building owners, because an energy efficiency investment lowers their operating costs, increases their net operating income, and creates a more valuable asset. Businesses benefit. So in an Energy Star certified building, it's a building in the top quartile of all buildings nationally with a score of 75 or higher, that building is 35% more efficient than the average building. So that saves the tenant about 50 cents per square foot. And that's money that then the business can keep to run their business instead of paying it to the utility. It can create jobs in the energy efficiency business. And we estimate that unlocking that whole $1.3 billion in energy savings would create 340 new jobs in energy efficiency work. We also will be a more globally competitive city. We know that Denver's leadership to date in sustainability helped win Panasonic to move their corporate headquarters here. We know that millennials, who are a growing part of our workforce, want sustainability. So it's part of our strategy to be a more globally competitive city. And so just to finish up, I'll outline what our Energize Denver Task Force is currently proposing. The municipal buildings would lead by example. And all the details of this can be found at energizedenver.org. So feel free to go there and dive in deeper. I'll go through this relatively quickly. So the first requirement that the task force is proposing is that building owners over 25,000 square feet would need to benchmark using Energy Star Portfolio Manager every year and report that score to the city. After this, in sort of the second year of reporting, transparency would be required, so the scores would be published. Those policies with benchmarking and transparency have seen 2 to 3% annual savings in other cities. And then the task force looked at next what needs to be done to improve, to encourage low-performing buildings to improve. So first, any building that's Energy Star certified, we just want to celebrate them and give them an exemption from doing anything else. But if a building is not yet certified, they would pick from one of 3 options, policy 3, 4, or 5. So they could improve their performance by 15% every 5 years. So this is on a 5-year cycle starting in 2021. Or they could do retro commissioning and implement measures with less than a 2.5-year payback. Or they could do an audit and implement the measures again with less than a 2.5-year payback. So the idea is to give them as much flexibility as possible, but to really get those low-performing buildings improving. So we'll have final recommendations at the end of June from the task force, and then be moving forward with how do we implement some of those recommendations through City Council. And I think that is our last slide. Here's our contact information, and again, all the details on the Energize Denver process are at energizedenver.org.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Katrina and Liz. We're going to move along and take questions for you on all that really interesting work. I know I have several for you. Hopefully we have some from participants as well. So if you do have questions, make sure you're putting them into the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen in the questions menu. You can type those in at any time. Katrina, if you could pass presenter rights over to Helen. And we're next going to hear from Helen Gurfel, who's the Executive Director of Greenprint at the Urban Land Institute. The Urban Land Institute works with the real estate sector around the world, and Helen's work is specifically on helping building owners, managers better understand their building performance, including energy use. Helen, why don't you take it away?
I have to give kudos to the Denver team for creating such an amazing and comprehensive plan and program. So it's really amazing and be phenomenal if other cities around the globe did the same thing. So as Eric mentioned, I will provide you with 2 examples today of how actions 3 and 6, so metrics and engagement, are really driving efficiency in this marketplace that we're seeing. I come to this kind of through these examples from the lens of the Urban Land Institute. Urban Land Institute is a 38,000 member global organization, and it has a multidisciplinary stakeholder engagement with real estate owners, investors, city planners, designers, architects. So it really creates a wonderful community to discuss these types of topics and really get the right mix of people to bring these projects and initiatives forward. And their mission for the past 80 years has really been to create sustainable, thriving communities. So the work that we do specifically at Greenprint really focuses a lot on that. We touch upon a lot of the 8 different actions that were discussed earlier by Eric and Jennifer, but specifically today I'll be talking about these 2 examples. And we come to it from the Greenprint Center. I'm the Executive Director of the ULI Greenprint Center. It's a consortium of real estate owners committed to improving the environmental performance of their properties, really through value-enhanced carbon strategies, primarily because with enhanced value there will be more traction. One-off projects that are just improving energy efficiency for the sake of energy efficiency will have some traction, but to have true global recognition and global traction, we really need it to create that value that Katrina mentioned earlier in her presentation as well. So our goal is to reduce carbon emissions by 50%, so really trying to set that target, and we do that through a large membership base, so really engaging with the real estate community. We pride ourselves on being an organization that is by the industry, for the industry, and it's really their leadership that is guiding our program of work. And one of the things that we do with them is that we help them measure and manage and create value for their portfolios through metrics. So we help them measure their energy, their carbon, their water, their waste diversion, projects that they're doing in their buildings, as well as other metrics. And we really feel that setting targets can really help impact and lead to market transformation as a first step, of course. And so we cover for our members, or through our membership, we're able to cover over 5,000 buildings and about 1.2 billion square feet of space, and across 51 countries. So this is a good start. We keep growing at about a 30% rate each year, so really showing that there is more and more traction within the real estate community to do this on the voluntary benchmarking side. So that's a really interesting aspect. We've been in existence since 2009, and since then we've been able to help our members reduce their carbon emissions and energy consumption by about 11%. And so this is kind of on the market scale, or across many different members. But then, you know, trying to demonstrate how our membership is using this type of data and information. And in some cases, it's very, very simple. In some cases, you know, we provide them with charts and information online to see how their performance is year over year, and kind of they can easily see where they have outliers. And this was an interesting scenario. This is an amazing property owner specifically in New York, and when they saw this data, they were rather shocked. And this specific property has a CHP system, a combined heat and power system, within their building, and normally it was performing quite well. But apparently this year that it had issues that they hadn't recognized until they saw some of their data in closer detail. And so they were able to go back, and combined heat and power is usually extremely efficient and really helpful to operations. But in this case, this one was quite old. I believe it was 30 years old, and they needed some repairs or replacement. So they were able to identify this and make the changes and make their property even more efficient. So, as Jennifer said, that's just one example of how we work with individual owners, but then we also work with cities as well. And we have a pretty focused viewpoint on cities. As Jennifer mentioned, emissions in cities are on the rise with increased urbanization, as well as we're seeing that many investors and real estate owners are choosing cities to make a good portion of their investments, or a majority portion of their investments, making it even more important for these investors and real estate owners to understand what's going on with their property so that they can make adjustments and improvements. And so, working with cities, we recently partnered with the Department of Environment in San Francisco. They had been collecting benchmarking data for the past 5 years, but never published a report, or never really looked at the data in a kind of a more comprehensive way. And so we partnered with them to bring the public sector mandatory benchmarking with the best practices in the voluntary space that we've been experiencing over the past 7 years. And we really tried to bring the private sector voice to the conversation, and have the private sector really reach out to them and say, here are some improvements that we can see, that we can make together. And together we wrote this public report that they utilized. And one interesting thing that came out of it is, you know, we constantly hear, well, you know, if I make energy efficiency investments, you know, what will that do to the productivity of the space? And you know, as we see in the decoupling economic growth and energy use, we can see in San Francisco specifically that their market value for real estate has risen over the 5-year period that we looked at by 80%. Their GDP has grown. Their employment in terms of FTEs in spaces has grown, while their energy consumption has been decreasing. So it's really a great story. And the other piece of this report was coming back to the dollars and cents of investing in these properties, is that 817 of these properties went through audits. And the auditors came back, and the engineers came back and said, if you invest $60 million, you would get an annual savings of $25 million a year, which is basically equivalent to $170 million on a net present value. So it's really, a lot of this makes sense, and it's not only at the, as Katrina mentioned, not only at the bottom line, but it's also driving tenant demand, right? And it's also driving occupancy rates and leasing velocity. A lot of these things that are a little slightly more challenging to to track today, but that's definitely happening in the market, and it's definitely moving the market forward and creating greater value for these real estate communities. So with that, thank you very much. I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. Wonderful. And again, I have some questions, but I hope that our participants will write in their questions in the question box, and we can get to them after our final speaker, who is Clay Nessler, who's Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at Johnson Controls. Helen, if you want to pass presenter rights to Clay.
I'm trying, but my screen will not cooperate.
Okay, we can do it for you too. Clay's going to talk a little bit more about his experience in this space, and really as a thought leader about the role of the private sector and how the private sector can effectively engage to support public sector work on transforming the market toward a more energy efficient buildings. Clay?
Great. Thanks, Eric, and hi, everyone. Great pleasure to be on the webinar today. I'm going to talk specifically about the roles and the responsibilities of the private sector as they engage with city leaders and organizations to help accelerate building efficiency in cities. First question is, why should cities engage with the private sector? I believe that that's critical because if you really think about it, the private sector includes the organizations that design our buildings, that construct our buildings, that retrofit our buildings, that operate our buildings, that finance our buildings, power our buildings, occupy our buildings, and perhaps most important, own many of our buildings in cities. They're an absolutely critical stakeholder, and in the process of collaboration between the public sector, civil society, and the private sector play a very, very important role. So, what challenges do cities face as they plan to accelerate building efficiency initiatives within their jurisdiction? The World Bank Group recently reported on a study they completed on the indicated nationally determined contributions that were submitted to the Paris COP21 climate conference. These are the basis for climate action plans that those national jurisdictions would put in place in order to meet the commitments they have made. And there was a general need from a majority of the countries for assistance in finance, technology, and capacity building. Well, those three things are really in the sweet spot of the private sector. The private sector will be involved in financing much of the improvements, mitigation, and adaptation that takes place as part of countries' climate plans. They bring the technology and the innovative solutions to be able to make those improvements on a cost-effective basis and really provide the needed capacity and capabilities to be able to achieve that at scale. Therefore, they're very critical parties in being able to help cities address those challenges. There are four key things we need to do in order to take advantage of the most cost-effective and practical approach to addressing climate change. And that is, we need to expand the scope of our activities. We need to take on more policies, more programs. We need to dig deeper in the retrofit of our existing buildings and be more aggressive as we address the design of new buildings. We all have to work to achieve scale, going from pilots to projects to large-scale programs and initiatives that bring both the public and the private sector into the initiatives. We need to increase the speed of change and accelerate, and finally we need to keep score, and the private sector can help in all of those areas. So specifically, how can the private sector help? So there are 8 areas that I think jump to mind. First is in the area of planning. The private sector tends to be very good at detailed action planning, whether that be business planning, operations plans, strategic plans. They're very helpful in working with cities and other stakeholders to determine the what, the who, the where, the how, and the when these programs and initiatives should be executed. They can provide practical advice on policies, which are true enablers. We know that ESCOs, for instance, have been effective in the United States in the public sector. We also know they've been very effective in China in the private sector. But we also know they've been somewhat less than successful in other parts of the world and in other sectors. And in fact, on a state-by-state basis, energy savings performance contractors go from being very, very effective tools to almost not used at all. PACE legislation, which Katrina talked about, many cities have had to implement 2 or 3 generations of PACE legislation to truly enable the type of investments they've been looking for. Also, the private sector can help avoid unintended consequences. For instance, in some cases where renewable energy is added as an alternative path in building codes, it's resulted in the construction of less efficient envelopes and equipment in buildings, not intended through that. Practices is an area. Large multilateral private sector players can share best practices between regions, and local companies can share the local practices that have really been key to progress in that jurisdiction. Projects. The private sector are the ones that implement the projects, and they know how to make them replicable. Going from just a sort of highly visible showcase project to something that would be more attractive and more scalable across a large majority of the building stock. Private sector understands measurement and verification. They can estimate savings performance, which will be key in building credibility and being able to report on the progress that cities make. Procurement processes can be a barrier. Governments can change fairly often, but procurement processes rarely do. And obviously, on the receiving end of procurement processes, the private sector can bring kind of a unique perspective on the effectiveness of those particular areas. The private sector is generally good at promotion. They can help promote programs and initiatives. They can attract building owners to programs. They can help recruit partners to join these initiatives and provide testimonials on the effectiveness of the programs. And then finally, public-private partnerships are a very effective way in bringing technology, finance, and capacity and scale to building efficiency initiatives. So obviously a critical player in that. So my final slide is really asking the question, when is the private sector most effective? And I think there are some unique responsibilities in the private sector as they engage to collaborate with government and civil society in initiatives such as building efficiency. First, the private sector needs to act professionally. It's an opportunity to act collaboratively with other private sector players and other stakeholders, not competitively. This is basically the time to remember the saying that a rising tide rises all ships. I like to think of it as the private sector working together to make the pie larger, to create demand for energy efficient products and services. And then somewhere down the road, the commercial organizations compete for individual slices of the pie. It's an opportunity to improve relationships, but it's not a means to gain preferential access. In developing plans, the companies participating need to work collectively in order to give confidence to the role of the private sector, not to gain individual competitive advantage. It's also an opportunity to enhance the collective reputation of the industry and not to promote individual commercial differentiation. The private sector also needs to be practical. They need, in order to achieve scale, we need to create demand, we need to expand supply, we need to deliver the results, and we need to follow the rules. We need policies, programs, and projects that will be very practical and achieve those 4 means. So focusing on what has worked in the past, what can work today, and more importantly, potentially, what will work in the future is the key responsibility for the private sector. And finally, private sector needs to be patient. Introducing policies, implementing programs, establishing programs and implementing projects takes time. The building community needs to be in it for the long haul. Creating future demand and reducing the risks of environment and improving future financial returns are some of the benefits that would come to the private sector as they actively engage and collaborate in developing these plans. Profitability is another key thing. There's not enough money, public money in the world to make the needed changes that we do. The private sector is critical to finance, bring capacity and technology to make these changes. In order to increase scope, achieve scale, and accelerate the pace of improvement, we're going to need market-based principles and the private sector to jump in with both feet and really work collaboratively to bring the needed results through. So thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to participate, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Clay. Some great thoughts there, and hopefully we have some additional questions for you as well. So we're going to move into the question and answer period now, thanks to all of our speakers. And also just to note that several of them were contributors to this report. Katrina and Clay in particular were our co-authors on the report, and were able to lend their experience in this area to the content in the report. So thanks to both of you. And as Jennifer mentioned, there are over a dozen partner organizations on this report. WRI was the lead, but there are several other NGOs and multinational or multilateral organizations who are partners on it. So as we move into the question and answer period, please enter your question into the question box on the, if you have not already, on the right-hand side of your screen. You should be able to find the questions section, and you can type it in there. And so why don't we start with a few of the ones that we already have as more come in. As a kind of a higher level question, there was a question about from the developing country context, which we didn't touch on in too much detail in this webinar, but there is a lot of content on that in the report that are relevant to not only the experience of developed countries, but also developing and emerging economies. So there's a specific question from Mazhar, who's a representative of the government of Pakistan, who was asking about, in developing countries, urbanization is speedily occurring without any planning. The existing structures there, it's near impossible to transform them with energy efficiency. And he was asking about what are the international best practices in this regard. That's a great question, and one we probably can't answer with full value in the time we have here, but I can maybe start by responding to that, and I don't know if our other speakers have thoughts as well. I would say two things. You're right in that existing structures are particularly difficult to address with energy efficiency, existing buildings, and that's true all over the world. The best way to make sure buildings are efficient is to make sure they're built right the first time. And that's doubly true in rapidly urbanizing places, because there's a lot of construction happening. So those are easy opportunities that can be easily missed, right? Because as Jennifer noted in her remarks, a building that's built today will last for probably at least 40 years, maybe upwards of 100. So I would say in developing cities, that's particularly ones with a lot of new construction, that's the first priority, and at least from a technical perspective. Maybe stakeholders have other interests and needs, but technically that's where a lot of the energy savings, the economic benefits, the emission benefits can be achieved. And so there are a lot of, and so that typically means code implementation, adoption, and there are, that can be a challenging activity, especially if there isn't already a model code in your country, the process of getting that implemented. But there are some really good examples of partnerships to help to create, in the absence of a code, to create a standard. So sort of an example of that is what Katrina was talking about with Energy Star as a way to encourage better performance activities even in the absence of a code. And there are other certifications and standards that can be used. Also, thinking about when compliance is difficult and ensuring that people are actually following the law is difficult, incentives to help people to recognize or make it easier for development to happen that is compliant with the law. So those can be incentives that don't have to be even financial, they can be regulatory in some ways as well. And then finally, to actually answer your question about existing structures, I think it's often easiest to start with component-based strategies. So thinking about appliances and lighting, which are large energy users in buildings, helping to make sure that there's access to the most efficient of those pieces of equipment used in buildings is often a starting point that can be built on from there to move toward more building-wide, more comprehensive building strategies for improving energy use in existing structures. Just a couple thoughts on that. I don't know if our other speakers wanted to speak to this issue of the challenge with planning and rapidly urbanizing countries and how to address efficiency there.
This is Jennifer. The only other thing that I'd add, and I think that those are all very important strategies or tactics, is that many times the urban form challenges that we talked about and the need for master planning and additional investment in the planning phase within the city are activities that there are good resources available. One of the partners that we work with often is the Clean Energy Solutions Center, which is a U.S. government initiative, and they have technical assistance available to provide for urban plans and for energy efficiency planning strategies and approaches. And there are many bilateral international organizations that have similar technical capacity and support for planning, training, and capacity building in developing countries in particular. So there may be some resources available that could be specific to answer or address either the need for planning at the city scale or the planning for energy efficiency improvements in cities.
Great. So if nobody else wants
This is
to...
Helen.
Oh, go ahead, Helen.
I would just reiterate some of the comments that Clay had earlier about engaging the private sector, both at the company service provider level as well as the real estate owners that own some of these existing building stock to really participate in that conversation and potentially help push the governments to make these changes, because I think independently, private sector or public sector, they can't succeed, but together they have a higher probability of making something work.
Thanks, Helen.
Great, important point. A couple other questions we have, actually a couple of specific ones for the Denver team. For you, Katrina, and Liz, a question from Rose, who asks, I know that the Denver Task Force has not yet given final recommendations, but is there any sense of how the city will verify policies 3 through 5 that you presented in your recommendations?
All right, so some of that is still being finalized, but I'll tell you what we know so far. So policy 3 would have a building that's not yet certified improve their energy use intensity by 15%, and that will be a self-reported number because we get the energy use intensity in part of their report through the Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool. So we're still finalizing exactly how much verification we would do, but we'll be able to certainly go out and audit and spot check those reports. And so we're finalizing exactly how many we'd be auditing and checking. The policy 4 and 5, where a building owner does an audit or retro commissioning and then implements the measures that they find, we're convening a quality assurance sort of subcommittee of the task force through the month of June to really finalize how that will work, but we think it's going to likely be some combination of who is a qualified professional to conduct an audit or the retro commissioning, as well as a checklist of what would need to be done as part of that process. And then I think we probably need some leeway for the implementing agency here in the Department of Environmental Health to really be able to use our discretion to know if it's a good audit or a good retro commissioning or not, because we don't want sort of low quality providers coming in and just quickly running through the checklist. We want these to actually be really good audits, and some of that I think we'll just be an ongoing process of learning as the audits start coming in, so there'll be flexibility to sort of adapt hopefully the rules and regs to make sure we're getting quality.
Great. One more specific question to you, Katrina, and then we have some more general questions for the other panelists too. There's a question about your budget, how big it is in Denver, and how many staff do you have, and how will that change once the Energize Denver plan is adopted, and then relatedly, where does that budget and those resources come from? I think this is a question that probably a lot of cities are going to ask, is how do you institutionalize this work? How do you make sure it's funded with all the other competing priorities that cities have?
Sure. So this is Liz. So right now, in terms of our large buildings efficiency staff, we're mostly supported through Katrina's efforts, through the relationship we have through the City Energy Project and IMT. So what we've been doing is creating throughout this process a longevity plan for how we will continue to fund and support this program beyond the City Energy Project relationship that we have and Katrina's support. So we are working through our city's normal budget process. We are developing a change request for staff, and depending on how the final recommendations come out from the task force, we'll either ask for 1 or 2 staff for 2017. And our budget process is probably much like many other cities. We have to show the need, we have to demonstrate the need, and show metrics and measurements for how we'll know that this investment is worthwhile. We're doing a comparison with other cities, other peer cities, to see how many staff that they have that work on their buildings programs. And so we can compare that and say, you know, Denver should have this many staff in comparison to other peer cities. And we're also looking to do some price raising as well. And then in terms of budgeting, we have some, you know, base budget within our program for our climate and energy programs. It's not a lot, but we're looking at how we can build up the budget itself as well to have funding for doing things like marketing and trainings and outreach. We do have some funding currently through City Energy Project. And then our budget, so we have a kind of a unique setup here in the division that I sit in within the city, where our whole divisional budget actually comes from, we own and operate the landfill, the municipal landfill, and so our budget comes from tipping fees at the landfill. So probably not as replicable maybe for others, but that's where our funding comes from.
Great, good to know. Thank you. So we have a couple other more general questions. One that I think is, I may actually expand a little bit. There's a question about, as a new local NGO, what can you do to influence sustainable city development? And I'd love reflections on that, but actually maybe I'll expand it a little bit to ask about, from your experience, the panelists, how do you start? How do you get started in a space like this if you're a new city coming to this? You know, we have these 8 actions, many options inside of them. What are your thoughts on how to get started and how to take action in a way that's going to set you up for success?
Eric, this is Clay. I have an idea. In the Accelerating Building Efficiency guide, there's a section in the back that talks about an assessment process. And the assessment process allows a city or other jurisdiction to essentially convene a group of interested stakeholders that would come from the government, both local, potentially regional and national, would include local NGOs. They could be small and limited to a given jurisdiction. They could be national, potentially international, as well as key stakeholders from the private sector. And it details a process and a tool by which they would go through the 8 action areas, make an assessment of where they are within each of those 8 areas, from planning to do something, piloting something on a limited basis, scaling it up, or fully implementing it. And then it allows them to evaluate the difficulty of implementation and the benefits that would come from implementing that policy, which would be very different from city to city. And then it provides a way to prioritize those based on difficulty and importance around midterm and long-term, where they would like to be. So it's an effective launching point to expose key stakeholders to these 8 action areas and to develop a preliminary plan. And we've done this both formally and informally with other organizations, and seems to be a good starting point. I'll turn it over to others to comment.
Thanks, Clay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? All right, great. A couple of other questions, some great questions here. Question about what other organizations, question from Jim McMahon. Hi, Jim. What other organizations facilitate exchanging information and success stories among cities globally? I know all of our panelists are involved in many different sorts of organizations. Could you highlight a couple of resource organizations for cities on the call and other stakeholders?
Well, I'll start us off on this question. There are a number of partnerships that already support city action in a variety of different areas of priority. So when you look at the groups that have been focused on broad sort of city peer-to-peer learning and exchanges, groups like ICLE or C40 or the Compact or Covenant of Mayors tend to be broad membership-driven organizations where you can find peer cities and communities of practice that have experiences in this area. I'll add that there are several partnerships that are more focused specifically on this challenge of building energy efficiency in cities. We've already referred to and discussed a little bit the City Energy Project, which is a platform that is supported by the Institute for Market Transformation here in Washington, as well as the Natural Resources Defense Council. An organization that does this a little bit globally, supporting private sector engagement in discussions with policymakers, is our Sustainable Energy for All Building Efficiency Accelerator project, which is a part of the Sustainable Energy for All's goals, which are generally to improve access to modern energy services, to double the amount of renewables in the mix, and to double the rate of energy efficiency improvement around the world. We're working with 23 cities specifically on learning these types of actions and policies and taking commitments within those cities supported by the collaborative project partners from the private and NGO sectors. And that is a dedicated resource specifically on this. It strikes me that there are many other networks that are specific to country level action or activity that could be beneficial in telling stories, as well as international organizations like ESMAP within the World Bank that do conduct analysis and could certainly share the findings via their websites and other platforms.
Great, yeah. A lot of resources, in some ways, sorting through them is the challenge. But some people on the call here, including myself, I'd be happy to help direct people. If you have follow-up questions, you can be in touch with me on getting started. Anybody else want to respond to that question? Hearing none. A couple other questions coming in. Question about in developing countries, how do you make governments understand the importance of implementing these actions on building efficiency? Maybe I'll take a first shot at that. I'd love to hear, in particular, Denver chime in. I think this is a really critical question, and the answers to this is very different depending on which scale of government and the priorities of that government. One of the great things about building efficiency and energy efficiency is that it has benefits, as we talked about, that are social, economic and environmental. So really depending on the priorities of that community, where they are putting their efforts, what are the top things they care about, how you go about that really is different, and understanding who you want to influence, what information you need to share with them about the social benefits or about the economic benefits for competitiveness or helping with air pollution. Those are challenges that are of different level of priority in different cities. So I think the critical thing is really understanding that, and then understanding how that difference is different from different levels of government, influencing local governments versus national governments and where their priorities lay, and how to work at the intersection of those priorities and communicate messages that are relevant and accurate to the right audience. Folks in Denver, do you want to speak to that about your experience?
Sure. I actually echo exactly what you said, Eric. I think you have to know what's important to your community as well as what's important to your decision makers and your private sector stakeholders who might be impacted by any policies that you develop. In Denver, we have really developed a very strong business case, so we're focusing a lot on the economic benefits of energy efficiency and how it will help Denver be a competitive city globally and nationally. But secondarily, we do have some air quality challenges in Denver, and so focusing on the public health benefits and the air quality benefits can also be a good message. There have been other cities that have focused much more strongly on the public health benefits and air quality benefits because that tends to be the primary issue that they might be facing in their community. So I can imagine that in the developing world, some of those kinds of arguments might be really powerful when you're talking about what the benefits are. But there are so many different benefits that you can really select among a variety of options to see what works best for you and your community.
And this is Katrina in Denver. I might just add that we'll often pivot our messaging a bit depending on who we're actually talking to, because this is a win for the economy, it's a win for the environment, it's a win for air quality, and we can lead with any one of those messages and then kind of back it up with the others depending on which audience we're focused on. Great.
Yeah, and thanks for answering specifically to developing countries, which I kind of neglected too, so thanks for doing that, Liz. We're running close to the end of our time here. We have a few minutes left. We want to make sure we end before or at the half hour as we scheduled this. Just a couple of other things coming in. One other organization to note that a participant wanted us to note is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which is an organization of peer-to-peer learning among actual sustainability directors for cities. And they have also doing some really advanced work on what's called the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance around cities who are actually aiming for carbon neutral goals. Maybe one additional question to add in here. There's a question from Sandeep about how has the financing aspect been handled for building retrofits? Are financing agencies keen to finance building retrofits? And relatedly, what are the challenges to engaging with the financial community? And how important is this question in getting buildings improved? Helen, do you want to take a shot at that?
Certainly. Yes, there are many financing mechanisms. I think historically there's been some issues on the demand side, right? So you could always envision that banks will always step up to provide the funds. There's a variety of range of issues, but some of it has been on the demand side where banks will look at these projects and say, hey, they're so small, they're hard to necessarily underwrite for the value that they're bringing into the bank. That's on the supply side of the funds. On the demand side, real estate owners are also looking at these types of projects sometimes and saying, it's such a small piece of my operations, right? Energy is about 3% of a building's operations, and they say, well, where am I going to invest in? Should I invest in this, even though the payback is so clearly short and so clearly beneficial in so many ways, whether it be for the environment, for the bottom line, for the people's comfort inside those properties. So clearly I think there's a lot of these types of projects have been somewhat anecdotal in terms of their return. And I think if we kind of commercialize or take them in aggregate, I know that we've had a project like this. I know that the EDF has had a project like this, the confidence project, in terms of building confidence for these types of projects. So aggregating them, really showing the industry what the returns can be to make it easier to underwrite for banks. I think we can get some more traction. Some projects that have been successful thus far are, for example, the PACE project that we spoke about for Denver. I know that in San Francisco, the on-bill financing projects have been extremely successful, especially if they come with additional incentives from the local governments. Specifically, on-bill financing, I think, is really wonderful because you know, as a utility, you know what the credit worthiness or the credit worthiness in terms of, you see that somebody's been paying their bills over the past 5 years, 10 years, and you know that they're going to continue to pay that bill. So there's less risk potentially involved in getting the payback from financing some of these types of projects. So I think that's been really successful as well, where those funds are available. There's also, in Germany, there's an interesting project that the government is doing in terms of subsidizing some of these types of loans. So it's kind of a public-private partnership that they've created there that's been really, I think it's the KfW Bank, that's been really successful. So there's some really interesting things going on globally, but the traction, I have to say, has been quite slow in really getting this to the market. One other kind of barrier that we're seeing, so for example, there's a company called Spark Fund that's providing financing, and I think the real estate community looks at some of these projects and says, okay, well, the interest rates are still too high for me to do these projects. And I think companies like Spark Fund and others are really seeing that when they actually provide transparency to their financing opportunities, they are a little higher. So I think if governments step in and help subsidize that, whether it be to decrease the interest rates for some of these loans, or to be able to backfill some of the loans in terms of the loss positions, I think that would be really helpful to getting more of these projects done. Hopefully that was helpful.
Great, thanks, Helen. Anybody else want to respond? How about Clay?
Nope, I think Helen covered it well.
Anybody else? All right, well, with that, I think we will wrap up, give you back 4 minutes of your time. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. And we have a couple of questions that we weren't able to address in the time that we had. We will have those and we'll share them with the presenters, and if they're able to, we'll see if they are able to respond to those and share them back with the people who have asked the questions. So again, the recording of this will be available. We'll send out an email in the next couple of days with the recording, a link to the report, a link to the slides, so you'll be able to reference these materials as you go forward. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks to all of our presenters and co-authors on this report. We really hope that this report will be a valuable resource, a tool, a guidebook that you can go back to as you're advancing your work, thinking about what strategies are relevant to your community now and how that changes over time as you have successes. And thanks so much, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everyone.